I have not been back to Canada in 7 years, and I want to talk about what it was like, what the reverse culture shock was like. But you learn to fear the police in the West because they're always looking for some sort of an opportunity to get you on something, or they're just power tripping and they're just rude to you. In my parents' city, you're not allowed to hang a clothing line out in your own backyard. You can't even have a beer on a canoe or at a beach or in public. You know, that's all a non-issue here. Regulated life is in Canada. What's up, guys? Coming at you from Chongqing, the cyberpunk city in China. I've seen a lot of videos recently of people coming to Chongqing from the West and reacting. And I always find it really interesting because, you know, living here for so long, sometimes you take for granted what outsiders would find interesting. And I thought, well, what about videos of Chinese people going to the West and reacting to that? I haven't seen as many of those. Doesn't mean they don't exist. Maybe they're just not showing up in my algorithms. But what about taking it one step further? What about somebody who was born and raised in the West and then moved to China, lived there for nearly 2 decades, becoming fully integrated, and having a very long absence from even visiting the West? Well, that's what happened to me this past summer. I have not been back to Canada in 7 years, and I went for the first time for a summer holiday with the kids. And I want to talk about what it was like, what the reverse culture shock was like, whether I became more or less sure about the decision I made to move and live in China, and just, you know, what kinds of conversations I had with Chinese people living in Canada. And maybe a little bit of politics too. It wouldn't be a Daniel Dumbrell video without politics. But I think I want to start with the first major sticking point, which was being reminded about how overregulated life is in Canada. In my parents' city, you're not allowed to hang a clothing line out in your own backyard. You're not allowed to park an RV or a tall vehicle over a certain height in your own driveway during certain seasons. I rented a cottage up north and took my family out there. And I was fishing out in the canoe. And one day, one of my canoe trips, I went back up to the cottage, and my dad asked me, well, what are you doing? You forgot something? I said, yeah, I think I'm going to grab a beer, have a beer out there. He said, oh, no, you can't do that in Canada. Can't even have a beer on a canoe or at a beach or in public. You know, that's all a non-issue here. And, you know, the police also, you know, my parents they've seen how I drive in China. They see how everybody drives in China. And they reminded me that you got to drive differently here. You got to, you know, if it's a red light and you're turning right, you make sure your wheels come to a full, complete stop. Because if you don't, even if it's moving even just a fraction, the police will catch you for that. The police are always waiting for people at the most opportune spots to give out the most tickets possible. For example, if you're going downhill in the 60 zone and it turns into a 40 zone or something like that, they will be there to hand out as many tickets as possible. Whereas it's kind of the opposite in China. There was one case where I heard where they were taking advantage of a high-ticket environment in Shanghai. One of my friends said he was riding his e-bike and there was a road where you're not supposed to go straight. You're supposed to turn right and follow a detour route. And a lot of people failed to do that. When they passed through the intersection, there was a police officer waiting there and getting ready to write them all tickets, until one lady started yelling at the police officer saying, we're all making the same mistake. Obviously, your signs are not clear enough, and you are supposed to be here to serve us. So why aren't you on that side of the street redirecting us before we make this mistake? And the police officer agreed with her and said, you know what, you're right. And they closed up their books and they went on the other side of the street to redirect people. I mean, that kind of thing is unheard of, especially kind of getting angry at a police officer. And that happens all the time here. When you see an argument between a civilian and a police officer, it's pretty much guaranteed that you're going to see the civilian yelling at the police officer rather than the other way around. And when you know, maybe 20 years ago, it was a little bit different. And there are different segments. There was something called the Chengguan, where they still exist. And they're kind of like city management police. They used to have a really bad reputation in China years ago. And now it's a lot better. You see this car cutting me off? I'm going to tell you. I'm going to touch on that topic in a second. But yeah, no, they had a bad reputation, and they were dealing mostly with people like, for example, shops who were putting their, you know, stuff outside their shop boundaries to sell, or chairs and tables where they weren't supposed to. And so probably the Chengguan had to deal with them on a regular basis and tell them the same thing over and over again. But regardless, still, they had a bit of an attitude on them. Not so much anymore. But here, you really get the sense, like, you're not afraid of police here. But you learn to fear the police in the West because they're always looking for some sort of an opportunity to get you on something, or they're just power tripping and they're just rude to you. I already had that experience in the summer in Scarborough Bluffs in the east end of Toronto. They had closed a parking lot to the Scarborough Bluffs early, kind of just arbitrarily. They just decided on their own before the closing time of the park, well before, a couple hours, even though there were parking spaces in there too. It didn't look like it was a city decision. You couldn't find it on the Scarborough Bluffs website. So we had to park really far away to walk in. But even when they were doing that, they just were full of attitude when they're saying, park's closed. No, go, leave. And you just don't get that kind of an experience here. I want to quickly shift gears to something a little bit more positive for a second, though. Friendly. People in Canada are so outwardly friendly, so much so that I forgot how friendly they were. Now, people are friendly in China, but it's shown in a different way. You know, if you're walking down a trail in Canada and, you know, there's nobody else on the trail, somebody's walking in the other direction, the opposite direction, they'll say hi to you, they'll say good morning to you, and that's really nice. You know, if you're walking into a mall and somebody's ahead of you, they'll hold the door open for you. And that's very nice. Sometimes it's a bit of an inconvenience because if you're a little bit too far away and they start holding the door open for you, suddenly you feel like, you know, a requirement, a need to speed up so that they're not holding the door open for you too much. But, you know, when I was talking to some of my friends in Canada about that, some of them are becoming a little bit more pessimistic, negative, disillusioned. I don't know what the right word is, but a little bit more negative about Canada. They said to me, well, that's only because people are watching. And maybe there is some level of truth to that. You know, because, you know, when you talk about, for example, people are so friendly, but once they get in their cars, road rage is way more frequent in Canada. They just become completely different people. And that doesn't happen as much in China. I mean, you know, the driving style is different, where people are kind of expecting you to pull out in front of people or to cut people off like that, what just happened. Or, you know, one thing that really struck me that I forgot about too is if you're on these like backcountry roads and you have to turn left onto a main road, people, if you're waiting behind somebody else who is also waiting to turn left, they will wait for an opening which is so large that anybody in the oncoming direction will not have to slow down even a little bit. They don't want anybody else to have to slow down for them, so they give a lot of room. Whereas here, somebody on the main road will proactively, even if it doesn't look like you're pulling out yet, will proactively slow down for you because they know that you're just going to pull out. And maybe it's just because of the population and population density. You know, it's not, you know, if everybody did that, everybody held doors open for everybody, if everybody waited for a giant opening in the road, maybe nobody would get anywhere, you know. So that's probably part of it. And then also, in terms of people, you know, this contrast of friendliness versus unfriendliness. I rented a cottage up in northern Ontario in a place called Burke's Falls on a lake called Jack's Lake. And we were going out in the canoe every day. We saw that there was this wooden dock, a little bit run down, but not too bad. It was anchored out in the middle of the lake. Didn't look like it was on anybody's property line. And so we decided one day to take our kayaks out there and just jump off of it, because the dock from our cottage that we had rented was too weedy and wasn't really suitable for jumping off of. And then some guy comes out in the distance, in a cottage in the distance. It for sure wasn't on his property line. But anyways, he yelled out, get off my dock. And I yelled back, oh, this is yours, sorry. I thought it was weird, but I was like, okay, whatever, it's yours. So we started packing up, we started getting our shoes on. Some of us already had launched off. It was me, my dad, my brother, and my eldest son who had been jumping off of it. Some of us had already launched off. And then his wife came out. And his wife just started going at us saying, I can't believe you're just coming out here and using our dock, and non-stop. And we were just kind of ignoring her. The husband went in. I think he was kind of embarrassed too, because he saw we were packing up. He saw we were listening to him. I looked up the laws afterwards, and apparently even if it's not on their property line, if it is their property, technically they should have oh, I just put it into manual here. They should have signs on it that say private property, no trespassing. They didn't, but when I looked up, it said, but if they tell you verbally to get off, then you got to get off, even if it's not on their property. Okay, whatever. So she's going, and eventually we start snapping back a little bit. I yelled out to her, I said, man, if yapping was an Olympic sport, you would be an amazing contender for Canada. And she also yelled out, said, how would you feel if somebody came over and used your toys? And it's funny she should say that, because that is one big difference. This idea of private property is held so sacred in Canada, maybe in the West in general, that even if somebody is using something of yours that will not inconvenience you in any way whatsoever, you have to put your foot down, because this is mine. Here in China, if you go to a park and some kids are kind of, playing, and they left their bike to the side or a scooter or something like that, some other kids might pick it up and play with it. And the parents won't say anything. The only time they'll say something is when they're ready to leave. They'll say, oh, sorry, we got to go now. We got to take that back. Maybe next time you can play with it again. Very common. That's the standard way of doing things. And so when she said to me, she said, how would you feel? It's funny she should say that, because we do set our toys out. We have an inflatable water slide that we put in front of our house sometimes. We fill it up with water. We turn the water on so it's spraying the slide, and it's, the slide becomes slippery. And kids from our neighborhood, dozens of kids sometimes, will come over and play on it with our kids. And sometimes I'll put some lawn chairs out in the front of my yard, and the parents will come and sit there, and I'll sit down with them, and maybe I've never met them before, and we just start talking. And I'm just so happy to see that there's so many kids enjoying that thing that I put out, the inflatable slide. And so it was bizarre to me to see this lady so upset that we were jumping off a wooden dock, a floating wooden platform that people were enjoying and having fun. I would have been so happy to see that. and maybe if I was still living in Canada, I had never moved to China, I would empathize more with her, and probably my mindset would be like, well, yeah, no, that is her property. You should get off. How dare somebody just come along and use it without asking? We didn't know who to ask anyway. But now it seems weird to me. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but this is just one of the things that stood out for me. Now, I wouldn't go as far as saying that what my friend said was true, that it's just because, when people are nice in Canada, it's just because people are watching. We were riding our bikes around in a park, and my son had fallen off his bike, with the pedal had fallen off, and he scraped himself up really bad. And he was obviously upset. We ended up parking our bike somewhere and walking around, because there were some farm animals to see and stuff like that. And somebody who was leading it looked like a special needs summer camp group. One of the counselors or whatever saw my son's knee and said, oh, wow, that looks pretty bad. I've got a first aid kit. Let me clean that up. And she cleaned that up for us. She was absolutely not required or obligated to do that. And she did that. And that was just so nice. Up at the cottage too, that we rented, you have to throw your own garbage out. You have to take it to the dump. And when we took it there, I wasn't exactly sure how to do things like you separate plastics and food and stuff like that. So when I went there, I was like, I don't know what to do. I separated the food, and she says, well, no, technically we don't have separate things for food. I have to charge you for 3 bags. But since you're being so honest and trying to do the right thing, I'll just charge you for 1 bag. But that was so nice. She didn't have to do that. So I think that amounts to genuine kindness. And you get genuine kindness, obviously, here in China too. And we've had people help our kids out when they were in need and stuff like that. But it just goes to show that there are genuinely kind people everywhere. What else happened? I spoke to a lot of Chinese people in Canada, and when I spoke to them in Chinese, it was really funny to see their reaction. I didn't film it. I wouldn't film it because it would become less organic. It was just funny to experience it. When I speak Chinese here, it's not as much of a shock because I'm here in China. Sometimes I get a reaction, but not like in Canada. But anyways, actually, even I went to a restaurant called Congee Queen in Mississauga, and there was a table of Hong Kongers who recognized me. They came up to me and said, "Are you Daniel?" I said, "Yeah, Daniel Dumbro." I said, "Yeah." He said, "I've been watching your videos since 2019, and they used to be anti-China, sorry. But after the 2019 Hong Kong riots, and when they saw how there was such a big disconnect with what was actually happening on the ground and how it was being reported, they actually became more pro-China. And a lot of these people I met who are from China or from Hong Kong, a lot of them want to move back now. A lot of them kind of maybe they see the trajectory of Canada and of China, and they just prefer China. There were a lot of, when I went fishing, there were a lot of Chinese people who were fishing. They love fishing in Canada. And some of them were talking to me because they asked me about my status in China. When they learned I had a PR card, they were really curious about that. And they wished they could get one too. Because, but it's difficult for them because they say that because they already canceled their Chinese passport, it's almost impossible for them to get. I don't know if that's true or not. But anyways, a lot of people wanted to go back. And it probably goes back to this, these little things add up when your daily life is just so regulated in Canada. It feels a bit overwhelming coming from somewhere like this, which I know this is going to sound totally bizarre and insane to somebody who has a stereotypical view of China, but you're just so much more free here on a day-to-day basis. But you actively see lives being improved here. You actively see policies constantly being changed. But no, I mean, it was a really good trip. And I became, I think, more sure about my decision to live in China. When I was in Canada, I felt myself trying to look for excuses or to convince myself that maybe it is time to move back to Canada, because I was having a lot of nostalgia. I was enjoying hanging out with my friends, my old friends, but it was something that I would find really difficult. And when we came back to Chongqing, it became even more clear that this was the city that I love. And I even asked my kids, I said, do you want to go back to Canada next summer? They're, yeah. Do you want to live in Canada? No. They also love Chongqing and they love China. So I think that became a lot more clear to me. But it was so good to see my friends. Some of my friends, I have a bunch of friends a lot of my friends are much older than me, 20 years older than me, so it was weird, seeing a lot of them face like major health issues now. One of my friends, who's more or less the same age as me, and who I've known for the longest, since elementary school, longest continuous friend. With all these friends, we just pick up where we left off from, like no time has passed, which is awesome. But I used to go on these adventures with her in my late teens and early 20s, where we would just get in the car and drive somewhere, randomly just drive somewhere. And I remembered a lot of those trips, but a lot of them she was reminding me of I had totally forgotten about. And it was weird. It was like, it was slowly coming back to me as she was mentioning it. And she had a theory. She said, well, because she still lives in Canada, sometimes she passes those same places and it triggers her memory. And I think that's true, because when I was driving around in Toronto, for example, I'd be like, oh, I remember when my car broke down here. And there's different things that are triggered by seeing the places that I had been before or where things had happened. But it was a weird experience too, because when I think back to that time, in my early teens or my 20s, time just seemed to travel so much slower compared to now. And I know this is a phenomena that a lot of people experience. There's an awesome podcast by a guy named Robert Krulwich on Radiolab, and he talks about that, why time seems to pass faster as you get older. And there's all kinds of different theories to that. Some has to do with just the familiarity of things. When you become more familiar with things, it doesn't seem like it takes as long. Like when you think back to a road trip, when you're going down a road that you've never been before, it feels like the journey takes much longer than when you're on your way back and you're already familiar with that road. And there's all kinds of other theories. I recommend that episode about time and how the perception of time changes. But what it did for me was it made this, it created a weird feeling of having lived an entire life before. My life in China is so much more different than in Canada, so it felt like I had lived two lives. And in some ways, it started making me feel a little bit old, because it was like, wow, this was so long ago, and life would pass by you so much slower. And, I guess it all depends. There's certain ways you think about things that make you feel old, and then there's certain ways of thinking about yourself that you always feel young. You're still that young person that you remember. You still remember your thoughts when you were a kid, and you're still that same person. So sometimes you feel like you're still a kid at heart. But that was a weird phenomena for me. And but it was, like I said, it was such a good trip. you know, I'm going to make a U-turn here because I actually passed my destination, but I still wanted to talk to you guys for a bit longer. But I'm on my way to a repair shop. I'm going to make sure my bike is all good because I'm shipping it down to Guiyang in just in the province south of here. And I'm going to be doing a bike trip across what will be the world's tallest bridge, which is opening soon in Guizhou. It is taller, from the base down to the bottom of the canyon, it is taller than the Empire State Building, antenna included. And I think I'm going to be the first civilian, non-governmental, not part of the construction company to ride a motorcycle across it, because they're going to allow me to ride across it before it opens to the public. So this is a little bit of a test vlog also, which is why I just kind of fired up the camera and started having a random discussion with you that I had not really thought through before. So hopefully it wasn't too messy and disconnected, but I just thought it might be interesting for people to consider, especially if they are about to experience reverse culture shock, if they have been overseas somewhere for a long time and they're going to be moving home soon. And just the kinds of the weird things, remembering all these different things and the phenomena of feeling like you lived an entire different life. I'm so glad that I did what I did, because it really does, like I said, feel like I've lived two lives. But yeah, I'm happy to see you guys again. I know I haven't been uploading for a while. If you want more of these kinds of random chats, either, while I'm driving somewhere, in my car or on my bike, just let me know. And if you want to see more about that bridge, wait, I think it should be coming in about 3-4 weeks or so, that video. Stay tuned, subscribe if you're not subscribed, and if you want to catch that video. And thanks for joining me for this ride, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.